a hotel of horrors, trapdoors leading to the unknown, gas chambers and chutes everywhere leading to a basement full of unspeakable atrocities. For over a century, H.H. Holmes has been painted as America's first and most terrifying serial killer, preying on the unsuspecting visitors to the 1893 Chicago World Fair. How many people did he kill? Well, if you're familiar at all with H.H. Holmes, you've probably seen numbers from 200 to 300 people bandied about all the time. And that he and the elaborate murder hotel he created were responsible for those hundreds of deaths. It was basically a purpose-built factory of death. But what if everything you've heard and seen is actually wrong? H.H. Holmes and his story has basically become an American legend. And legend is probably the right word for it, because in and amongst all those things you've probably seen and heard, there's a lot of fiction and not very much fact. So today, I thought we'd go over the man, the myth, and the murder castle and find out just how much of it is actually true. And of course, at the same time, we're going to draw him, because I figured this dark, creepy dude would fit a dark, creepy charcoal portrait perfectly. So let's crack on. Now, for those of you who aren't really familiar with H.H. Holmes, it's probably a good idea to go over a little brief biography of the man and what he actually did before we get into the details of his murder castle and his murder victims and find out exactly how much of it is true. While we do that, we'll start drawing. So I've got a soft charcoal pencil here, and we're going to make this very dark and broody, which is good because it means we can just lay down a lot of dark shadow on this. And H.H. Holmes is famous for being portrayed wearing his dark black bowler hat, so that'll be a nice feature of this picture. So H.H. Holmes was born in 1861 in a place called Gilmanton, New Hampshire in the United States. Roughly about right. I have the band on his hat about here. And he was a well-known swindler, trickster, con man, all the rest of it, who is widely regarded as the first American serial killer. Obviously, you know, in the 1800s, people didn't really have the term serial killer. That didn't come around for a lot longer. But if you're looking at any time, outside of, the American Civil War, then this guy, we know, did kill a lot of people. So definitely a serial killer. Gonna go in with this pan pastel just to add a base for the hat. Now, H.H. Holmes was not actually his real name. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett. And Mudgett is a hilarious name. He clearly didn't like it, otherwise he wouldn't have changed his name to H.H. Holmes. So we're going to call him Mudgett for the rest of this video. Because, f*** H.H. Holmes. He might not have done everything he's reported to have done, but he was still a killer, so he can get f***ed. Sorry, Mudgett can get f***ed. Quick thing from me, if you're enjoying the video so far, remember to like and subscribe. That stuff really helps me make more of these. Back to Mudgett. So he was born into a wealthy family, and it was clear early days that he was intelligent and had a keen passion for medicine, should we say, which demonstrated itself in his reported cases of him trapping animals to experiment on. If there's a number one red flag when it comes to serial killers, it's usually torturing small animals. That's where it starts. That and, significant head injuries in childhood. They're the ones you gotta look out for. But he was clearly talented, and his wealthy family afforded him to be able to go to medical college. But he was something of a mediocre student at medical college. Didn't get on very well with, actual academia, but had a very strong interest in it regardless. Let's just come here, and it's important when you're drawing to pretend as though you're actually following the shape of the real thing. So this bowler hat here would obviously be curved in real life. And if you pretend you're actually drawing onto a 3D object, so I'm drawing around the curve of the hat here, it does actually help to create that illusion of it being 3D. What you're doing is you're essentially giving, even though there aren't clear lines necessarily, you're giving people subtle lines for their eyes to follow, which tricks them into seeing that third dimension in there. But as with all charcoal portraits, we can keep this a little bit loosey-goosey. And in 1886, Mudgett moved to Chicago and became a pharmacist, which is where he took on his persona of Dr. H.H. Holmes, clearly embarrassed by his glorious family name. It was around this time that he's supposed to have begun killing people chiefly to steal their property. And it's also when he built his murder castle. Now, what do we really mean when we say murder castle? Basically, it was an apartment block. It wasn't an actual castle. But the story goes is that over a period of years, he had many different architects and workmen, builders, etc. coming in to work on his murder castle. We'll go into a little more detail on what was supposed to have been in there in a sec. And it was in 1893, during the World's Fair in Chicago, that he was alleged to have killed several women. His MO being to seduce them with promises of marriage, etc. He'd become engaged to them and then kill them after he'd secured their life savings. All right, let's try and get some of that shirt in. We'll try and frame the face before we go and start adding some more detail. Apparently, Mudgett also required his employees to set up life insurance so that when he was done with them, he could kill them and claim any money that they had for himself. And then he supposedly went on to dispose of the bodies by basically selling them to medical schools and hospitals. Now, in 1893, Mudgett was arrested for insurance fraud after a fire at his home. But it didn't come to anything and he was released. He then got into a whole fraud insurance scam situation with an associate of his, Ben Pietzel. Pietzel. Not sure. Whoops. Love this. This pan pastel is really good for just laying down a lot of charcoal all at once. Really giving you a nice solid foundation to then detail on top of. They were going to defraud an insurance company by faking Pietzel's death. They travelled around committing fraud together. They were briefly arrested for fraud. It was a whole fraudscapade, a whole little fraud holiday they went on together. Eventually, while in jail, Mudgett met someone called Marion Hedgepeth, who was a career criminal and agreed to help out with the whole insurance fraud thing. What that actually ended up in was Pietzel moved to Philadelphia. Mudgett got out of jail, followed him to Philadelphia, and killed him. Like, actually killed him, not the fake death they had planned. Once he'd killed Pietzel, he convinced Pietzel's wife, who had been aware of the scheme, that Pietzel was actually still alive. But this clearly led to some paranoia on Mudgett's part, because he decided that he needed to get rid of some of the potential witnesses against him. And that meant 3 of Pietzel's 5 children had to go. So he killed them. Now at this point, clearly Hedgepeth had decided to turn the other cheek and become a better person, because Hedgepeth alerted the insurance investigators to everything that Mudgett had been up to. And he was arrested in Boston in 1894. Right, I'm just gonna blend these edges in with the pan pastel that we were just using, giving charcoal this kind of rough sketchiness to it. I want it to look like it's actually been drawn, you know, we're not going for photorealism here. I want you to be able to see the rough edges. it's very difficult for me to not desperately try and make something look as accurate as I possibly can. It's really, really more difficult than you'd expect to find that there's a really fine balance between, let's say, photorealism and actual creativity or, like, you know, style. It's very difficult to find that line and have something that doesn't necessarily look like a picture, because ultimately I know it's, you know, it demonstrates good technique and skill, but why not just take a picture? So, Hedgepeth turned him in, and after that betrayal, when he was found in Boston, he was taken back to Philadelphia and tried for the murder of Peetzel and sentenced to death by hanging. And that is a very brief synopsis of Herman Mudgett's life and deeds. But according to the legend, there's a lot more to it than that. And there is a little bit more to it than that. According to the legend, Holmes lured hundreds of people into his twisted hotel, full of all of its nasty surprises. Now, this place, if you believe what the press and what historians, you know, in the years since have written about it, was an absolute hellhole. Doesn't look it from the outside. From the outside, does kind of just look like a very normal apartment block. And let's face it, it probably was a very normal apartment block, at least for the 1800s. But if you were to believe the press at the time, and some historians since, it was actually full of the following fun little features. There were the secret passageways, hidden passageways riddling the inside of the building, which allowed Herman Mudgett, allowed Mudgett to move silently through the building without alerting his guests to his presence, and also allowing him to transport the bodies of the dead to his various workshops, torture chambers, his furnace in the basement, all the fun little treats that he had set up. He used these secret passages to go everywhere and spy on everyone. 2. Hidden trapdoors. Again, positioned all around the property to facilitate Mudgett's comings and goings and his spying and his ability to quickly surprise a would-be victim and then transport and dispose of the body. And to be fair, investigators did find these trapdoors around the house. Number 3, asphyxiation chambers. Apparently there were various chambers, guest rooms, that kind of thing, throughout the house that Mudgett had set up with various gas pipes connected to them. And at any point, from a control panel in his office, he could release a toxic combination of carbon monoxide and various other poisonous gases into a room to take out some of his would-be victims. And these rooms in this 1800s apartment block were obviously airtight, so none of the gas could escape, and soundproof so nobody could hear the screams. And there were reports at the time as well that Mudgett used peepholes to observe his guests as they succumbed to the fumes. Number 4, soundproof rooms. Now obviously Holmes didn't want anybody hearing what he was getting up to in his wonderful little hotel. You couldn't just have people wandering past on the street hearing screams coming from inside. So obviously soundproof rooms was a must. And clearly H.H. Holmes had access to far better soundproofing materials in the 1800s than I do now, because let me tell you, trying to soundproof a room to do a voiceover or something like this, which actually this house does date back to the early 1900s, it is almost impossible to soundproof this place. So he must have had some pretty thick walls. Now, if he wasn't selling the bodies, how else was he disposing of them? And the answer to that was quicklime pits. Now, apparently Holmes had various pits of quicklime carefully secreted around the building where he could chuck an unwanted corpse whenever he needed to get rid of something. And sure, you might ask, Tom, would the guests staying there not have been able to smell dissolving corpses in multiple quicklime pits positioned all around the building? But he had loads of quicklime pits where he was dissolving bodies around the place. Don't question it. Next, suffocation beds. If airtight suffocation chambers were not enough, he needed beds that did the same thing. So these beds were apparently essentially mechanical traps that at any point at the push of a button could be closed with an airtight seal that would then suffocate the victim inside. And could apparently also be superheated to speed up the killing process. Well, next were all of the chutes that ran all around the house. That again, obviously, he was using to send bodies all over the shop into his various torture chambers, quicklime pits, down to the basement. And again, sure, you might say, hey Tom, didn't most houses during that era have chutes that led down to the laundry that you put clothes in? And they went down to the basement where everything could be washed. Weren't they used for that and not shoving bodies down? Next were all the hidden staircases. Obviously, you've got hidden passages everywhere, you've got trapdoors, you've got all this kind of stuff going on. You need some fun hidden staircases, some which apparently led to nowhere, just to walls, some that dropped into pits. I mean, the place sounded great. It sounded like a proper haunted house that you'd find at a, well, literally at a fun fair. So, that was the murder house. Or murder castle, or murder hotel, whatever you want to call it. It was full, absolutely riddled with all of these secret chambers, horrible torture rooms, gas chambers, like all of this nut stuff was in this one building. And that was the story for a very long time. More recently, we have historians coming out and claiming that, surprisingly, that might be bullshit. And one historian, Adam Seltzer, wrote in his book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, that things maybe weren't quite as sinister as they seemed. Seltzer said, there's a total of about 9 people we can say with confidence he probably killed. He confessed to 27 at one point, but many of those people were still alive. The exaggerated numbers, that came much later. The first myth that we have to dispel is that this was a murder hotel, when in reality, it wasn't a hotel at all. On the first floor of the building, we had storefronts, and the second floor of the building is where the living apartments were. Then there was the basement underneath, and then there was a supposed third floor, which is where he got up to a lot of his horrible stuff. But in reality, a third floor was never even actually finished. So that's strike one to the stories. Then there was a particular book called Gem of the Prairie, which is possibly where a lot of the main legend began. It was in that book that it was suggested that Holmes had killed about 200 people. And once this spectacular number had been suggested, remember, America was not used to serial killers at this time, so this was an incredibly popular story. So as soon as this crazy number of 200 victims was suggested, the press and future true crime writers absolutely ran with it and started reporting it anywhere and everywhere. It was pure, straight-up sensationalist journalism, or what people have described as yellow journalism, where people are literally just making stories up. If they're not just embellishing the truth, they're making it up. And this carried on, this kind of reporting, writing, all of this carried on for years and years and years, to the point where even I, at one point, believed it all as fact. All of the information about the murder castle, the number of victims, all of it, without any research and without looking into it at all, most people just accepted as the truth. That this one man got away with killing that number of people in this insane house where he had all these contraptions and secret compartments and everything that it was claimed was in there. It was all made up. It was all made up by the press. They wanted to turn him into the boogeyman. The whole legend really comes down to some very dubious reporting by the press. If we didn't already need reminding that what the press report and what people report and say matters, because people won't look into it themselves. They'll just believe it. And then this is where we end up, with completely and obviously bogus stories being accepted as the truth. But it's important not to forget that that doesn't mean Mudgett wasn't still a murderer. Maybe just not quite the murderer that we thought he was. And he very clearly was still a murderer. He was caught up in this complicated web of scams and fraud and, insurance scams. That was all still going on. That was real. Right, let's go in with my favourite now, our little wad of paper. Oh, actually, no, I'll go in with my finger first and we'll smudge up and smooth out some of those darker areas. So, when he was finally arrested, after being given up by, his career criminal jail friend, it was only for the Petzl insurance scam. At the time, they didn't know anything about any of the other murders. Only that he'd killed Petzl and then tried to hush the whole thing up by taking out some of his kids. But obviously, that's still quite a lot of murder. So even without the murders of the other women, he was still going to hang. Our Mudgett wasn't going to get away with it that easily. Now, obviously we know the stories about hundreds of victims were just not true. But what about the 27 he actually confessed to? Well, if you remember, it turned out that quite a few of the 27 people he confessed to having murdered were still alive at the time he confessed. Not quite as dead as Mudgett, who, let's say, was fond of a tall tale or two, had claimed. In fact, going back to our historian, Adam Seltzer, he's put forward that there are really only about 9 of the 27 people that he claimed to have killed that we can say with any confidence that he actually did kill. There is no evidence at all that he was killing random attendees of the World's Fair. The 9 people that we know he killed were people that were already known to him. So, who did Holmes actually kill? Well, we know he killed Petzl and Petzl's children. Oh, by the way, Petzl's children, who he murdered, were aged roughly from 7 to 14 at the time, so that was really cool. But there are also, but we can't forget, the women he seduced, who we do know he actually killed. 2 of which were Julia Connor and her 6-year-old daughter, Pearl, who disappeared around 1891. And Holmes actually alternately denied killing Julia and then also admitted killing her during a failed abortion. Again, very difficult to know what to believe when it was coming out of Mudgett's mouth. But ultimately, we don't know how he killed Julia and Pearl. We don't know exactly what happened to the other women. Emmeline Segrand and sisters Minnie and Nanny Williams. We know he killed them. We know he had relationships with them and we know that they disappeared. That's about as good as it gets. We just have no solid evidence for what it was he actually did to them. We're just pretty sure he did, which obviously sucks. It means he never provided real closure for the family and friends of those victims. And when it comes down to it, we're talking about him being convicted of the murder of Peetzel and his 3 children. He wasn't. He was only convicted for the murder of Ben Peetzel, not the children, because there just was no evidence that he was actually responsible. They were gone, they were definitely dead. But again, he was clearly very good at covering his tracks. And when Holmes was executed in 1894, this is the thing that always blows my mind, is he was only 35. I don't know why, but you just see this man, everything he achieved, albeit, terrible things, and he was the same age as me. Everybody from that period looks a lot older than they actually were, which comes down to, fashion and attitude and all that kinds of stuff. But yeah, he was only 35 when he hanged. And even after his death, the myths and the legend making didn't stop. Newspapers and different people claimed that he'd switched his body out, that it wasn't him on the scaffold. This insane reputation that he'd picked up as this crazy boogeyman followed him even after death, and which only helped this false narrative, this fake legend grow over time. And so ultimately, that's what we have to remember. Yes, the stories about his murder castle were completely fabricated. It may have been a very poorly built, mismanaged, weird, higgledy-piggledy 1800s property, but it certainly wasn't full of booby traps and acid pits. H.H. Holmes definitely killed people, but hundreds? No, definitely not. Not even the 27 that he admitted to killing. For all the lies and incredible made-up bullshit, it's obviously important to remember that somewhere in there, real people were tricked, swindled, and ultimately murdered, including children. This man was still a monster, and it's important to remember the real people who lost their lives because of him. Now, with really lovely guys like Mr. Mudgett here, I usually like to add a little extra thing to it. And sometimes I like to make that little extra thing something they really wouldn't have liked, especially when they were straight up awful bastards like our Mudgett here. So, I've got just the thing for him. Perfect. I'm sure he would have loved it. So, as usual, thanks for watching, and let me know what you think. Did H.H. Holmes, or Herman Mudgett as we've come to know him, did he really kill 200-300 people in an insane building he designed himself specifically for death? Or was he a con man who tried to commit a bunch of fraud and in the process did actually kill some innocent women and children? Let me know what you think, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.